Hey everybody, welcome to my review of Outlast. Yes, I know it's a game that came out over a year and a half ago originally, and over a year ago for the PlayStation 4, but I only recently got the system and the game, and only recently got my channel back in order. So here's my review. There's going to be 5 categories, and then an overall impression at the end.
Little pig.
The sound in this game is really quite good, as it should be with a horror game, but others have missed it in the past. Not Outlast though. When you're walking on a creaking floorboard, it really sounds like you're walking over that floorboard. When you're running for your life and you hear your breath huffing, and you bash through a door, it all sounds right on. And there's the ambient sound effects as well, those that happen not directly tied to what's going on in the game. When you're cautiously creeping through a tunnel, or trying to avoid an enemy, you'll just hear these creaks and scratches and screams that aren't related to anything going on in the screen, but still work to instill terror in you as the player, and work quite well. Though I do have to say that sometimes there were too many ambient sound effects. I would almost want the game to shut up every now and then, because it was just too much. Too much clawing and noises and horns, and I needed silence, not just to recuperate, but because it seemed like it was drowning out the game. Some silence can work as an even more frightful device, and I hope that's something they keep in mind for the Outlast sequel. For a horror game, Outlast has surprisingly good music. Not just music that works in the game itself, but music that I'd listen to outside of playing. I actually have I have all the tracks because I purchased the soundtrack, but I have a handful of the tracks on my phone to play in my car as I'm driving around. They're that good. Now that's not saying that it's some of the best music that any video game has to offer, or that it can compete with music outside of video games, but it is still pretty good. And the last thing I have to comment about the sound is the voice acting. It's actually really good in this game as well. They hired actual actors, and they do a very damn good job. Especially my man Neil Napier. If you don't know who that is, he's on a show named Helix, plays a character named Peter, my favorite character in the show, and he's really good in this game. Both of the roles that he plays, although they're both short, because it's a horror game, you're not doing a whole lot of conversation, but the roles that he plays are amazing. And other, I'll just say, enemies are really great as well. I don't want to spoil anything in the review, but even the short lines that they have, and sometimes a really long handful of lines, are done perfectly. Now I'll start off saying this about the graphics, that for a game that came out in 2013, they are a little poor. Now, I understand Red Barrels isn't that big of a company. They're actually a pretty small company, and so to produce the game that they have is quite an achievement. And I will keep that in mind, which makes the graphics come off quite a bit better than they are. It's not that they're bad, it's just that they are of a slightly lower quality, especially when you have the opportune times in the game to look at the variants, the bad guys. When you look at them up close, they just don't have that polish that I would have liked. They almost seem comical more so than scary. Which is not to say that some of them aren't scary. There's one particular enemy that follows you throughout the game that's horrifying no matter how you look at him, no matter what angle you get or how much time you spend with him. He is a scary motherfucker. But aside from that, most of them really aren't that scary. Even the guy who sort of kidnaps you halfway through the game, and sorry if that's a spoiler, he's just sort of goofy looking when you've been through it more than once. But don't let that deter you from purchasing the game, or playing it at least. The graphics themselves aren't really what you're in it for. It's a horror game. You spend most of your time hiding, running, and dying. The times that you have looking at the enemy are few and far between. Only when you've played it a bunch of times like I have and experienced it and know when you're safe and who you can look at does it become less frightening. And besides, the animations are done extremely well. There is very little that you don't believe is happening. The only gripe I have is when you're in a cutscene and an enemy throws a punch directly at your face. sometimes it looks more like their hands are flopping at your general face direction than delivering a punch. But honestly, aside from that, completely believable and completely well done. Maybe one of the best animations I've seen in a game. Now there's also less going on, so that's a little unfair, but it still is what it is. Now I'm not a person who's typically bothered by frame rate. I can't typically tell the difference between 24 and 30 and 60 or whatever. As long as it's fluid and functional, that's good enough for me. However, I am disturbed by when there is a significant frame rate drop, and I found a few times in both the vanilla game and the DLC that the frame rate would drop, and not at always dangerous or important parts where you needed it to be steady, but just at strange parts. I don't know if it was loading issues, I couldn't quite tell, but it definitely would sink to almost nothing for a short period of time now and then. And then that brings me to my last point about the graphics, which is the visuals themselves. That is what this game is known for. If you've seen any review or any clips of Outlast, you know that it is horrifically violent, and it's even worse than probably what you've seen. There are blood and guts and disfigurement and dismemberment and all kinds of stuff all over the place. And not just with the enemies that are chasing you, because, as I've said, they can look a little silly, but the ones who aren't chasing you, the still bodies, the still graphics, those are the things that are definitely disturbing. I'm not going to go into any details because it could be spoilers, but both in the vanilla game and the DLC, there are some truly horrific images. Not the kind of stuff that, if you're an adult, will keep you up at night, but still, I mean, this goes without saying, you don't want children to see it. Maybe anyone below 18 you don't want to see it. But it's very well done and pretty extremely graphic stuff. So that's a word of caution going in. I loved it. It does a great service to the game. If it's not your bag, if you're not interested in seeing that kind of blood and guts, to put it lightly, then that might be something to make you steer clear of this. The writing of Outlast is interesting in that it takes place in an insane asylum, so you expect people to be crazy. And that's what it is, people are crazy. But they take it a few different routes with different kinds of crazy, and they almost seem to be written to argue with one another. The characters don't actually argue, they never even interact with each other. But the scenes themselves, the craziness itself, the different kinds of crazy, are almost in counter to one another. And it works really well. As far as lore goes for this game, there's really not a whole lot going on. You could make a small video about it, but it would honestly be very small, like maybe a few minutes. I'm slightly considering it, but it seems like more a waste of my time, because A, I don't think anyone would be interested, and B, there's not that much content. But the story itself is something to marvel over. Now, it's a pretty simple story. A reporter shows up in an asylum, crazy things happen, and then the DLC has a guy who informed the reporter, and then crazy things happen. But, without giving anything away, take my word that the stories interconnect in a very significant and cool fashion. Cool is not a very professional term, but it's true. The stories of the two games, well, the main game and the DLC, interconnect with one another and form this complete story that not only works really well, but makes you completely interested, super interested in playing again. You want to see the little things that you might have missed, to see what you can pick up on. And they're there. If you look really hard, you'll notice these little things. Now, there's more of them in the DLC, because they created it afterward and had that base of the main game to work off of, but it's still there. As far as the gameplay of Outlast goes, it's a different kind of game than I've typically played. I'll be honest that I haven't played that many horror games. They're just not something I've usually gotten into. Mostly because the good ones are all on the PC, and I certainly don't have a gaming PC. What you're capable of in Outlast is running, hiding, and dying. That's it. It didn't take me that long to get used to it. I was sort of used to it from other games in the past, like the Souls games, for example. You do a lot of running and dying in those. Not a lot of hiding, but a lot of running and dying. Anyway, In addition to the camera being at your disposal to both record and use for night vision, it all works mostly well. You run, you hide, and you die when it's time. I do have to complain that there are certain times, and it almost seemed at random, that you would either not jump or not hit a lever, not open a door, whatever action it is you're trying to do. Your character just wouldn't do it. This could tie into that frame rate issue I talked about earlier. I'm not 100% certain. I tried to test it, but they both seem random, so I was unable to fully figure it out. And that did also result in some deaths that made me pretty upset at the time. When I die because of a game failing me, that's not a good thing. One of the hardest things to judge if done well in a game like this is the puzzles. There were a lot of times where I wasn't certain where to go, and it took me a really long time, with many deaths, to figure out where to go. At times it felt like as if there was no option, as if I was just supposed to die. I tried going this way, that way, and nothing would ever work. And it became frustrating to the point that I wanted to stop playing. Sometimes I even did stop playing. And while that shouldn't necessarily be corrected, because that's a lot of the game, figuring out what to do, the deaths sort of ruined the experience for me. And you might be asking yourself, well, how can that be? Death is supposed to be the point. It's a horror game. You said it yourself, you're going to die. You run, hide, and then die. And that's true. And it wasn't the death itself that ruined the game for me. I shouldn't say that ruined the game, it's just that marred the experience a little bit for me. It was that the death took me out of the experience. I still remember my first playthrough, where the first, let's say, half an hour, I was terrified. I was peeking around corners, hearing the weird noises in my headphones, knowing that a certain guy was hunting me, and I was freaked out. But then when I got to the first part where I died regularly, a handful of times in a row to the same guy, I suddenly realized I'm no longer scared. I'm just dying and trying to figure this part out, and it just feels like a game. And frankly, it feels like a very frustrating game because I can't figure it out. Instead of having the time or ability to figure it out, I just die, because you die really quick. While trying to figure out these hallways and these weird things that I've never seen, the guy would come up and kill me. And it happened so many times that I was removed from the experience. I frankly spent the rest of the game not scared. And that's not to say that it wasn't scary, there were still scary things going on, but I wasn't as fearful. I wasn't cautiously checking around corners and breathing heavily, clenching my breath. None of that happened any longer. It pulled me from the experience. And it wasn't because of the loading times, they weren't that bad. It was dying over and over again while being unable to figure out the puzzles. It made it feel like too much of a game. Which is a really weird complaint, but it's one I have to admit. Now what I'm going to say next might sound completely contradictory to what I was just saying, because what draws me to this game over and over again, and I've probably played it 20 times now, is the atmosphere. For a game that I just said drew me out of the experience, it is such a thrilling experience. Even when I know precisely what to do and can rush my way through the game, it is a world built around you that feels so real. Every nook and cranny of it is just stuffed with dilapidation and craziness and psychotics that it just really fills you. It's a world you... Not that you want to be in it, because, you know, it's an insane asylum where everyone's being killed, including your character at sometimes. But it's a world that you would want to be in. It is rich with atmosphere. The noises, the music, the characters... It's the thrilling place to be. There's probably no better game, or no game that has better atmosphere. That's a tall thing to say. I don't know if I'd actually stick to what I just said, but I can't really think of a game that has better atmosphere than Outlast. On that issue of atmosphere, that is what got me to play through the game as many times as I did. Without that thick atmosphere, I don't think I would have played it more than a handful of times. The game itself is not that long. I can't know for certain, but I would say my initial playthrough was 3-4 hours. We can even top it out at 6 just because of pausing and bathroom breaks and all that. when you play it and know what you're doing, for example, I can now beat the game in about an hour just by rushing through, because all the extra stuff that you can find I don't need to see again, or at least I don't feel like I need to see again when I'm just playing for fun. So that's not a bonus, or it's not a point in its favor. It is a very short game compared to how it feels originally. That said, if you're the kind of person who likes to play a game over and over again, particularly when it has great atmosphere, this game is perfect. It doesn't really feel like a time sink at any point. The puzzles are all pretty much the same, figure out where to go, what button to hit, and how to stay alive, but they all still feel fresh because you're running for your life. You'll have that heart-racing moment every time. Frankly, and I don't mind sharing this with you even though it could be considered spoilers, if you don't want any of the trophies to be spoiled for you, go ahead and skip to the summary section right now. Because the atmosphere was so rich and the game so interesting to play through, it was enough to make me go for the insane trophy. If you don't know what that is, let's just keep it short and say that it's ridiculously hard to get, or at least it seems like it when you don't know for sure what you're doing in the game. It was the kind of thing where I died so many times that I was considering just giving up, but I kept at it because the atmosphere was so incredible. And it was worth it. I eventually got the insane trophy, which was insane. In summary, Outlast is a short game that has severe replayability if you're into that kind of world and atmosphere. The visuals are a little behind the times, but it did also come out 2 years ago, so that should be forgiven. The animation works mostly well. There are a few frame rate drops, but nothing that stops you from enjoying the game. The writing is incredibly interesting, especially if you play the DLC near or right along with the main game. The game controls completely well, there's almost no hiccups in that, and then the music and sound effects are both pretty much top-notch.